Welcome to another episode of You're Not Depressed, Just Unfinished. Today, we are going to talk about touch, the power of touch for emotional healing. For over 30 years, one US-based psychotherapist has been using touch in her practice. Touch is an area of practice that actually the field of psychotherapy does not talk about it enough. And yet, touch has proven to be very powerful for healing, emotional healing, trauma healing, and to bring better, deeper, faster results. We will learn today why is that. We will learn about what is touch and how does it help us, and why the field of psychotherapy, even the society, has left it behind. Today, we're going to reverse that. Let's welcome Barbara Collier, my colleague. Barbara is a somatic therapist, psychotherapist, and a certified somatic experiencing. She will explain what all this means. Somatic experiencing is a very powerful methodology and practice. She's a colleague of one of the pioneers in somatic therapy, Dr. Peter Levine. And she has been on a healing journey of herself, and she co-founded Equinimity in Tucson. She is a pioneer, and you will learn why. And she has worked on the edges of somatic healing, touch, sexual trauma, grief, and equine-assisted healing. Barbara, welcome. Welcome. And please tell us if I missed anything about introducing you.
You didn't. Thank you. That was beautiful. I appreciate it. It's really nice to be here, Ardashir. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. And let's get into it. Touch. What is it about touch that people, the listeners, need to know?
So much. I think touch is primary to us. We know that we can't survive without touch. Babies can't survive without touch. Appropriate, healthy, attuned touch. We know that from different studies in orphanages where the babies' needs were cared for in terms of what feeding and eating, but they weren't touched, they weren't related to at this nonverbal level, and they did not thrive. They did not grow. They did not get a chance to develop properly. It's quite significant. They literally didn't develop neurological connections because of that. So touch is primary.
And touch, it's interesting you talked about children. So we grow up, typically, most of the world is through touch, hugging, and physical contact. Then at a certain point, words come in. I remember at a certain point growing up, I was told, sit there, don't be fidgety, put your hand on your lap. And connections, hugging, and physical contact basically disappeared. It was 4 or 5 years old. What is the impact of that?
It's massive. That would take a whole other year-long thing, I think, to talk about the fullness of the impact of that. But it goes towards the fullness of our development. We don't develop our senses fully when we're not touched, when we're not in the nonverbal. One of the things that I've learned so much about working with the horses is that how much communication happens nonverbally. In my world of psychotherapy, we always say communication, 85% of communication is nonverbal. And so yet then as humans, we're communicating in that 15%. So what else is being communicated? What are we missing if we're only focusing on that 15%? And that's massive. So that's one easy way we're missing. So what is the implication of non-touch? 85% of the ways that we connect, of the ways that we feel and know ourselves is missing when we don't touch, because touch is one of the languages of the body. And when we're acknowledging the body, and when we've acknowledged our bodies and other bodies below the level of words, then we come alive in different ways. We listen differently because this thing is awake now. We have an understanding of wherever we bring our attention, that thing flourishes. And if we're bringing our attention to the body and to all the wisdom in the body, then that will flourish. But if we're ignoring the body and we're trying to not have a body because maybe something happened back then that was not doable for us to live, so we had to ignore the body, not intentionally, then we're missing out on a lot of knowing, a lot of different ways of knowing and locating ourselves relationally and in connection.
A question for you, the curiosity question. So you and I know many psychotherapists. Majority of them don't know about touch. They don't even want to touch the touch. But how did you arrive at this body of knowledge?
I'm a very kinesthetic person by nature. So I need to engage my deepest learning through contact, through touch, whether it's standing by a tree and leaning against it, or laying on the ground, or leaning against a friend. That's how I learn the best. I'm also very experiential. So I don't have, my easiest learning environment is not book related. It's story related. It's felt. If I can be fully in it with all of my senses, I can learn it. It's very difficult for me to not have my senses and just have it be intellectual. And so I came into psychotherapy with that. That's how I am. And I also came into psychotherapy working with young children who were birth to 6. So nonverbal. Most of the families that I work with had children that were nonverbal. And so if you're working nonverbally, you can't work verbally.
That's right. That's right.
And so you have to find a way to connect, to relate, to have that really special connection that's with an infant or a young child who's scared and in a new situation. And then what do I need to do? How do I need to show up such that I can reassure that child that I'm not going to hurt them? And they may not yet. They just know the felt state. And I can't, no matter how I show up, it still may not translate that to them, which it can't, for me, it can't be mandatory that you will connect with me. Can't be. It's just the mandatory thing is how I show up. I'm open. I'm here. I will treat you with the highest regard from my heart. And if that feels safe enough, then we can take the next step. But I will wait until you're ready. So that's what working with children is about. And so the children that I worked with had a lot going on in their little short lives on the planet here. And it was quite tragic and also made the connection that much more precious. Very much like connecting with a wild animal or an animal. You're not speaking the same language and you have to find a different way to communicate. So I came into it like that. And so presence and touch are very similar. We can be touched by presence. We don't have to have actual contact to work with touch. And so that's part of it also. And because
two things you mentioned: presence, that the other person, a child, an adult, they feel you're there, you're seeing them, and touch. There are two different things, but presence also, you're saying, is as powerful as touch.
Yes, presence can feel like touch because that's probably a different thing, but because of who we are as humans, we don't have to experience touch from actual contact with the body. We can experience touch outside of ourselves because of that electromagnetic field that comes from our heart. That's a bigger topic, I realize. And so I came into psychotherapy from a relationship-based somatic approach from the very beginning. And I was, at that time, touch was forbidden in psychotherapy, so I did not do it. And I had been trained by Hugh Milne in the craniosacral realm, and I decided not to go that route. I went into psychotherapy instead. And then in 2011, in the state of Arizona, the ethics changed, and they removed any words that said anything about don't touch. So I was happy about that. And I went to a lawyer and I said, hey, will you please look this over? Because I'm reading, there's no wording in here that says not to touch anymore, but there's not any wording that says go ahead and touch. So the lawyer read it over and said, indeed, that is the case. It's saying there's no wording saying don't. And the implication is then for my profession in the state of Arizona, if you have a scope of practice to touch, meaning that you've been trained in some touch modality, you can go ahead and.
Yeah, that's right. Let me ask you, I know listeners want to know touch. So give us an example of the clients you worked at. What the touch actually looks like.
So I'm trained in somatic experiencing, and that's a modality that was co-created by Dr. Peter Levine, and he really, through his observations in nature and wild animals and looking at nervous systems, realized that basically what I'm saying to you now with this language of the body, that something else is needed in terms of how we include ourselves in any therapeutic process. And so he's all about including the body in the process. And he has a whole program around the wisdom of the body and body as healer. And that is true. So when we can connect from a relational place with ourselves, acknowledging our own bodies, everything is different from there. So somatic experiencing, soma means body. And somatic experiencing means what is your body experiencing and how do we know? Not what do we think our body is experiencing, but what is our body experiencing? And that's a beautiful journey that we can all be on. That's relational. Then we're being relationship with ourselves. We can say, my mind is thinking this thing. And then I can look inward and I can say, hey, body, how are you responding to this thing? That's somatic experiencing. And that is an important, that was a game changer for me to learn about that because it gave me language for the thing that I was already practicing, which is how do I include my whole self?
That's right.
And so when I work with clients the clients that I work with have pretty significant complex physical health conditions. Part of that is because of my interest. I was a nurse. I was an intensive care nurse before I was a psychotherapist. And so it gave me the capacity to understand complex physical health conditions. And I started to learn pretty early that these complex physical health conditions were most likely related to the way that we needed to navigate our early childhood experiences.
Yep.
And that would stay in the body. And so touch can get at those early childhood relational patternings that can cause all kinds of complexity in our adult. Touch can get at that in a very different way than words. We need both. We need both.
The one of the clients that I worked last year, a business executive, and she came to me for high level of anxiety that she was taking medication. Is that I always feel in business meeting, board meeting, I'm in a free fall. Just basically, there are no floor beneath me. In our session, I asked her permission. Can we practice something? And always very gently, I came to her left shoulder, sat side by side next to her, right hand gently between her shoulder blade. And I said, how does it feel? How does it feel to lean back? And she was crying and she just felt, I feel my feet. I feel my buttock. I feel like the ground beneath me. And so that was a game changer. And she then said that she doesn't remember any memories of being held as a child. She was very gifted professional. But some of that, her body didn't have a sense that you're held. You can lean back and somebody catches you. This is what you talk about, correct? The power of touch, very gently to change the dynamic of emotions.
Absolutely. To change the dynamic of being present, like you allowed, she got the impression from you that she could inhabit that whole moment. And that's one of the things in the somatic experiencing training There's 6 modules, and then the last 2 modules are the advanced ones. And in the very last advanced one, the second advanced one, there's touch that they teach. And that touch is intended to support people with movement and also coherence. And so you did both for her in that moment, and that's beautiful.
So one of the things you mentioned, and you know this very well, that as we enter the professional world, the business world, there are boundaries, even in your like a manual of employment manual, physical touch, proximity, all of that. So all of that, their legal language about no touching. So how do we navigate something like that about power of touch and power of even being close? How does this settle with professional people?
I don't think I can speak to it in terms of in a corporate business, but I can speak to it in community and in families. It needs to be consensual. My hope for everyone is that we can develop a consensual, attuned relationship with ourselves, others.
You talk in your writings about the original wound and how we enter the world and then something happened, we leave our bodies behind, the original wound. Say more about that.
Well, I, in my curious mind, I've tried to go back to when did this start? How did we get here? Why? Why is this? And I don't have any answers for that at all. But I do have a sense from what I've read and what I've experienced that whenever that point in time in our history as people on the planet, of the planet, when we decided intellectually we as humans were no longer part of nature, that we were separate, that's an original wounding because everything, excuse me, everything in nature is relational. Everything is connected to everything else. And we're learning more and more about that now, which is very exciting because those are the things we knew back in the day. And because we've extracted ourselves from that, we've lost our meaning with that. So that's the original wounding, is that when we start to feel and believe that as humans, we are supposed to dominate nature and we are supposed to shape it and it at our own whim, that's non-consensual. Outside of relationship in that. It may very well be that nature in that moment might be very abundant and say, please do whatever you need. But we're not asking and we're not paying attention. We're just seeing and taking. That alone is separating ourselves and making this hierarchy when there is not one, actually. Everything in nature is part of the entire ecology equally. Less of a mattering than a tree. And neither are we. And so that's the original wounding. And when we can be in that again, in that relationality again, without it being hierarchy, it is, we behave differently. We receive information differently. So that's the original wounding. And then what we did on top of that, after that, is we said, our mind is separate from the body.
That's right.
It is not.
This is so powerful. It is so powerful. A report came out from Harvard Business Review 3 years ago that up to 50% of US CEOs report being lonely. Not lonely at the top, lonely as a human experience. In a room full of people, they feel lonely. These are people who got to the top, as you mentioned, by taking, by pushing, by dominating. And now they get there and they just feel separate. They are not connected. And looking at the report, they just report it as facts, deal with it. But there are not many insight. How did they get there and why that emotion persists? That lack of touch can create loneliness, separation that persists through life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know that all the 50% got there through dominating and taking. I don't want to make that presumption.
Mhm.
And I think it is a lonely road in that way.
Yeah.
And so we can find ourselves separate from. And I will say that there's a beautiful and painful paradox in being human.
Mhm.
I try to reduce things down to their simple truths, right? So we are a person. I am a person. I have this shape as a body that makes me an individual, right?
Mhm.
I can be an individual in myself. And because of my wiring, just like everyone else is as a human, I have the capacity to be in this individual state, but I also have the capacity to connect deeply.
Yes.
And and especially if my system is open, I can connect very deeply. So in any given moment, I believe as humans, we are supposed to embody both of those experiences, being autonomous and
Mhm.
being connected. And
Autonomous
so,
and connected.
yes. And so in the United States of America, we have been focusing on that individuality. Be an individual, be yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that because we do need to develop ourselves. However, when it's the only thing we're developing, it becomes problematic. Because yes, we are an individual, but we also have this capacity to connect deeply with
Yes.
another, whether that's another human or nature or the cosmos or whatever. And therefore, if we're only focusing on one pathway to what
Yeah.
the expression of being human is, we're missing out on the other half. So if I'm focusing only on this deep interconnected we, I'm missing out on the autonomous me. And if I'm
Yeah.
only focusing on the autonomous me, I'm missing out on this interconnected we. And yet
Yeah.
we are both. And so in order for us to feel whole, we need to have the capacity to get at that autonomous me alongside that connected we to
Mm.
really have an experience of being human. So that's what I would say regarding the CEOs is that they've done their job.
Yeah.
They've been listening, they've been doing the thing that the culture has been sharing to do, and they've been focusing on the autonomy. And
Yes.
that interconnectedness might be not very present in their lives. It doesn't mean they're broken. We
Yeah.
are wired for that. They can get
Yes.
there just with a little
Yeah.
focus.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
This is so good. One of the things that I noticed working with the senior professionals, they can wonderfully talk and analyze feelings, and yet they are not feeling the feelings. As you mentioned, dropping into the bodies, they can describe, I think I'm feeling angry, sad, or the, the really happy about something. When I ask them, where does it show up in your body? Then the question is, what the heck does that mean? Where do I look at it? And then I should, where does it feel in your chest, in your belly? And then all this sensation come up. How do you see that? In the back shoulder, tightness around the neck and the jaw. So this is about bringing the body into the conversation. Something to ask you, your perspective. The power of touch when we deal with trauma and sexual trauma, that how does that come into play, bringing touch to healing those wounds?
Anytime there's been physical abuse, whether that's sexual or physical from hitting or anything like that, and it's especially when it's been in early childhood, we need to understand that then the skin is remembering that, particularly with physical abuse. The skin is remembering that. And
Yeah.
so that then when the skin receives touch of any kind, it's not going to be necessarily in a ready place for that. And we can see that really clearly through animals who have been abused. They cower, they shiver, they're like, don't come near me. We
Yeah.
have that same response in our bodies, but we're not allowed to live that out because of our social rules. And
Yes.
so that's what we need to know first and foremost before touch ever occurs anywhere, whether it's in an office or someplace else. And so with sexual violation, It's much more complicated than that because it doesn't only live in the skin. It lives in the sexual organs. It lives in the body. And most importantly, it lives in the flow of aliveness.
Yes, yes. And then this is the part that touch, a positive experience of touch can rewire and replace that early emotional wounds.
Yes. And to that, I would also say sometimes the abuse and neglect and the sexual trauma come in before even words. And so before it pre-verbally. And so it may not be a rewiring. It may be a wiring, which is different because that means that this organism hasn't had that experience to lay down that neurological network for connection.
That's right. That's right. So in your office, a unique feature of your practice is that you have a sofa, you have a chair for clients, and you have a massage table. So first of all, that is so fantastic. And I love to learn. So when your clients come to you, at what point and what is the process for massage table that says, hey, do you want to try that? Or how does it work for clients to experience that massage? And what happens actually?
That's a great question. And so when I work with people, they've either met me out in the world and at a or so they've heard me speaking about touch and this relationship and how we get to be ourselves. And so usually it's already in the field. But for people who I haven't worked with, who I haven't met, I usually offer an 30-minute meet and greet in which I let them know how I come into this work. And I let them know right away that touch can be a part of it. And when they come into my office, they do, like you said, they see a massage table, and we never start directly there. There needs to be a readiness in order to do that work. And I've learned through my clients what that readiness is. And part of it, a big part of it, is that person needs to be able to have a connection, enough of a connection with themselves. But before we table work, they need to have enough of a connection with themselves that they can report what's happening in their inner world, somatically, emotionally. And so it doesn't need to be like, they don't need to have a huge literacy or fluency with it, but they need to have enough of that before we go to the table. And for example, I was working with a man who was an anesthesiologist, and he was quite numb. He reported himself to be quite numb. And we were working together weekly for a while, probably about a year before we did the touch work. And he had pretty severe physical abuse when he was younger that was sustained for a long period of time in his early years. And so we had done some prep work around that in session. And then seemed to be time to do the touch work on the table. And so the touch work that I do on the table is not massage. People are in their clothes. They're on their back only. I never work with a person face down to each other the whole time. And it's a slow process to even get to the table. And so he was laying on the table, and I was doing a little work I had my hand underneath his back at a area that supports a settling of the autonomic nervous system. And he dropped into this beautiful kind of space of his eyes closed, and he got more body based than thought based.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of silence and quiet, and his eyes were closed. And I could feel this settling in his body. And then I could also feel this movement towards, okay, we're done. The body was like, okay, we're done. And his mind was not receiving that message. And so it happened a couple of times. The signaling from his body happened a couple of times. And then his mind wasn't picking it up. And so I supported that when the body came in and said, okay, I also did that, a little more pressure. He did respond to that. And then I realized that I needed to just say his name gently and say it was time to come back out of this because he had gone away somewhere. And so I realized that even though I thought he was ready, he wasn't quite ready enough to stay with the signals from his body before he went other zone. He loved the zone he was in. However, that's no different than what his chemical addiction had been. And so we don't, we want to, it wasn't relational because he was just in this other zone now. He was no longer human. And so I learned from that. And I said, okay, we need to not do any table work again for a while. And then we worked on what we call interoception, is his capacity to look inside at what's happening with his body at not the level of emotion, but at the level of what his body language is, and with that respond to it, not in a hypervigilant way. But so it was probably a good 9 months before we went back to the table work. And we did it. That was great. That was a big learning for me.
Barbara, I love listening to your experience. The way you're describing that, I could literally feel those moments with your client and that sense of presence, body, where the emotions and where the sensations were. You have a very descriptive language. I love it.
Thank you.
About grief, where does grief live in the body? And the reason I ask this, the social media is abuzz with discussion about grief. And many people talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, that you go through grief, 5 stages, you're done. And then people talk about a different version of grief. How do you relate to grief, understand it, and what is the body way of grieving?
That's a beautiful question. It's really rich. I don't have a sense of a particular location in everyone where grief lives. I think grief lives where the person experiences it. And so that's a huge part of my work, is not presuming that I know where something lives. I don't, if I'm doing dream work, I don't ascribe to predetermined symbolic meaning. Those can be useful for sure. But so if somebody comes in and they dreamed about a dragon or something, I'm not going to look up the symbolic meaning of dragon. I'm going to explore what that means for them. And as they're describing it, I'm going to be wondering where that lives in their body. And so same thing with grief or anything. I'm not going to have an assumption of where grief lives. And grief has many different faces to it. And so the person whose work that I love the most, that I feel like is the most comprehensive, is a man named Francis Weller. And he has a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And I love it because he's not talking about stages and phases of grief that we move through or that we get stuck, which I appreciate that, because grief has all kinds of different flavors and textures and experiences in our bodies. And just like if we've had a loss of a human being in our life that we cared about, nothing will bring that person back. And so it's really about, what is my relationship to that loss and how does it shift and change and grow over time, where I can be present to that. It may mean that I'm grieving and longing for them for a while. It may not. And so there's grief of a loss of a person, which is different than the grief of things that didn't happen for us when we came into this world, which is different from, grief of where the planet is right now and what's happening in the world. That's a very different grief. And my friend, who's very much of a naturalist, she said, we don't have even a word or a felt state for the loss of our favorite tree.
Yes.
And so that's its own thing also. And so I think it goes down to sorrow. What is it that brings us to sorrow? And to me, grief and sorrow are different. Sorrow to me is like connective tissue. And it's the thing that connects us to everything else in addition to life itself. And if we're touching into sorrow in a way that's not overwhelming or traumatic, it's part of life itself, and it makes life itself more precious.
Yes. There are listeners who they're hearing us they have partners, they have children. What do you wish them to know about power of touch in relationships with their partner, children? How do they bring that into their own connections?
I think that what I would love for people to know is that touch matters and presence matters. And taking the time in your day and in your personal practices to connect with yourself and your own presence are as important as food and water.
Yeah.
Because then when we touch from that place or we connect from that place, whether it's through touch or not, it's going to be different. And that's what's
Yeah.
needed. And that's the same thing for grief and sorrow, is that I think we need to have personal practices of how we get to relate to and be with our grieving, not just stuff it down or stuff it in. We need to have personal and collective practices for this. We need to have personal and collective practices for how do I get to embody myself in this moment? And so I think when we focus on that, our own presence is in the utmost importance, then whatever goal we're going for changes.
That's right. That's right.
I'm a process person. And so
Yeah.
I don't want to get to an end of something having left myself behind. When I was in nursing school, I loved it. It was highly intellectual and I loved the learning and it was fabulous. And I went right into the intensive care nursing, and that was great for my love of intensity and excitement and all the things that were going on. But I had lost touch with my body completely. And even basic needs. Didn't know when I was hungry, didn't know when I was full, didn't know when I needed to care for myself in terms of toileting and things. And so it was a long journey back home to connect here.
Yeah.
Yep.
Having grown in Middle East, in Iran, we were a very huggy culture. Then when I came to the States, one of the first things I learned, that's not cool. You don't do that. And I didn't realize that what I missed. So later on, I got married and we have a wonderful son. And so we have a ritual that when we hug, maybe lasts about 5, 6 seconds. What is experienced when you hug the person is not just you embracing them. You just feel their heart, you feel their soul, and you make yourself available to them. And it's so electric. It's so rich and it's so quick. Literally, it's under 5 seconds. But both of us walk away smiling and beaming that I got you. I'm here for you. You're here for me. And I'm thinking, I missed that for years. And with clients, you don't do that. Handshake is all you do, but there's that whole sense of connecting soul to soul. It just, to me, is such a gap, such an unlearned, untapped skill.
It's true. There's people in the world of psychotherapy who have done a lot of research on the efficacy of touch and whether the ethics of it. And there's a lot of evidence. So they did a study that long ago where they looked at different cultures and how often people touched in an hour-long conversation around just casual, well, this other thing. And so the United States, and I think it was the United States, England, and Finland scored the lowest out of all the other countries. And now they've redone it, and now the United States of America is the lowest for touch in a casual conversation. And people are pointing to that now saying, wow, that's problematic, that we're missing something with that. And so I think psychotherapists need to know that, just to know that and see if you know that, then what feels different. You don't have to have an embracing hug to do touch. You can hold hands and gently and just gaze in each other's eyes for a moment and have that presence. I see you. I get you. All of you is welcome here in this moment.
That's right.
And you can have those conversations with people around touch. It has to be consensual. And if there's been sexual abuse or physical abuse, I would say erring on the side of caution, going to make it even slower before you do the actual touch and have conversations and have practices where you're making sure that both of you can see when there's activation and pause and stop.
Yes. Yes. In the business world, it always fascinated me that when there's a gathering, why do people love icebreakers so much? This is a time that you hang around, you exercise, you touch, you push, you pull. And when I learned this is a time that the roles, expectations, project plans are aside, is person to person. And people love it. You see them beaming up, opening up, laughing, new behaviors show up, new emotions. And then you go to the project and somehow that's all left behind. That there's an element of connectivity, as you mentioned, that is the whole person, that people are hungry for it. And there's so much room for that to bring it more as part of continuous partnership.
Yeah.
As we getting close to the end of our time, what are the recommendations, suggestions you want to give to our listeners?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing is having practices that allow you to be yourself more fully. And how you show up as yourself, not as a performative self, or I think I should be this way, or my best self, or whatever. It's not that. It's how you let your whole self be in a moment, in any, whether that's at work or in relationship or in community or driving your car, it doesn't matter. And that you matter. The fullness of who you are matters. And the more you get to know who you are, the better for everybody.
Wonderful, wonderful. The listeners will get to, they will have access on the podcast. There will be links to your website, to all your information. People can find you and find about your practice and your writings. And the key message here from Barbara is a better way forward. In addition to the world, to the language we have, is bringing your whole self forward, paying attention to and connecting at the much deeper and much more natural ways. Hope this was helpful. Pass it on and follow Barbara online. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Lovely chat.